A closer than expected result moves Brazil into a second round of voting for president. While some anticipated a more than 50% first-round majority for Lula, it seems there's more support for Bolsonaro than polls had predicted. So, could Brazil be heading for another far-right victory after all? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Brazil. Well, the opinion polls that had Brazil's Lula da Silva and his Workers' Party, in some cases, running away with Sunday's presidential election, turned out to be no match for the voters themselves.
It is now mathematically confirmed that there will be a second round for the election for President of the Republic.
Well, Lula garnered about 48% of the vote, ahead of incumbent Jair Bolsonaro's 43%. A smaller margin than predicted that sends an already heated election into a second round. But for Bolsonaro, those numbers confirm something else, a conspiracy against his campaign.
We overcame today's lie. Datafolha saying it would be 50-30. We overcame that lie. We are moving forwards, where all is now equal, and we will better demonstrate for the Brazilian people.
Now, the two contenders have a three-pronged challenge ahead of them: get their supporters to turn out again on October 30th, capture the imagination of Brazilians who didn't vote for them, and finally, convince as many of the 37 million people who either spoiled their ballots or evaded voting on Sunday to vote for them in the second round.
To the disgrace of some, I have 30 more days to campaign. I love campaigning. I love going out on the street. I love rallying. I love getting on a track. I love discussing with Brazilian society.
But despite Lula's optimism, solid policy discussions are likely to take a back seat in the weeks ahead. It's more likely we'll see plenty of insults and accusations. And joining me now to discuss where that might take the country are from the state of Sao Paulo, Pedro Rossi. He's an economic advisor to Lula da Silva and an associate economics professor at the University of Campinas. In Washington, we have Chayenne Polimedio. She's a Brazilian affairs analyst and senior research manager at the Partnership for Public Service. And completing our panel also from Washington is Langevin, the director of BrazilWorks. We also reached out to a representative from the Bolsonaro campaign, but unfortunately did not hear back in time. Pedro Rossi, I'm going to start with you. You were fairly confident, actually, that Lula could take this election in the first round. Not only did that not happen, but the margin between Bolsonaro and Lula was much closer than polls predicted. So what happened?
Yes, thank you for having me. I think Lula is very close to a victory. Lula is still widely favored to win. There's very little to go. And the Labour Party has made his better performance in the first round ever. So Lula has won twice, and the Labour Party has won 4 times, and they never won in the first round. So it's actually normal to have this kind of voting. Of course, there was a surprise. I think the far right in Brazil is very strong, but I think we are very confident to win this election in the second round.
Okay, Cheyenne, you think that confidence is justified? Because, I mean, in spite of the polls, this result, some are saying it doesn't even give Lula serious momentum going into the second round. I mean, why did opinion polls seem to mask some Brazilians' love of the far right?
So I think there are a couple of things going on here. While I still agree with Russ's general statement that it is likely that Lula will win the runoff, there are a lot of Brazilians that either didn't feel comfortable saying who they were going to vote for in the elections, which is why you see this really big gap. I think the polls were predicting that Bolsonaro will get between 36 and 37%, and you see him coming up with 43%. So a lot of shy voters that didn't want to say that. And the second piece that I think happened here was a lot of Brazilians, as they saw the percentages that the other two candidates were getting, so Gomez and Tebet were getting, they probably switched their votes and they decided to vote for Bolsonaro. So this is actually going to be very close. And in fact, the results that we saw for this first round, the 47 and change for Lula and 43 for Bolsonaro, that's the smallest gap that we've seen since 1989. So it's incredibly tight.
Right. And, you know, Bolsonaro's party also did very well in the Senate race, in more than half the seats available, you know,
Precisely.
19 out of 27. So it was a remarkably strong performance all around. Let me turn to
Yes.
Mark, though. You know, remembering the kind of doldrums the Workers' Party was in when Dilma Rousseff was impeached, I mean, how generally kind of surprised are you that the party and Lula have made any comeback at all? And what does it say now about the actual state of the country, since it does look like Lula might take the second round and really make a comeback?
Andrea, it's a good question. I think we've all seen that Brazil has started to take a look at two different ways of looking at the national development and the international picture. One is this kind of far-right, anti-globalist, whatever that means, represented by Bolsonaro, and increasingly his kind of conservative national coalition. And the other is a real standard kind of social democratic, developing industry, developing the workforce, and looking to engage the world on a number of issues. And that's something that Lula represents. I think there's still a majority of Brazilians who want that kind of traditional social democratic outlook with national development and international engagement. But yes, Bolsonaro did do very well, better than expectations, but he has a very high rejection level that's going to limit his ability in the next 4 weeks to pull this out.
You know, Mark, you once said that Jair Bolsonaro was, and I'm quoting you, uniquely unprepared to be president when he was elected. I mean, do you think somehow he managed to prove himself over the last 4 years? Could that be another reason he has this support at this point?
I think he's, I hate to say that I'm right, but I think his treatment of the COVID-19 pandemic clearly showed that he's completely unprepared to govern a modern, complex society like Brazil. But through social media and this kind of, you know, siloed media representation of the symbolic issues related to conservative nationalism, such as patriotism, anti-communism, these kinds of things, he's been able to overperform, I think. And I think the Workers' Party and Lula has struggled to fully communicate across the board to Brazilians who aren't members of labor unions and activists and social movements, having very difficult time communicating to them what it means to develop Brazil into a modern society. And I think that's something that Lula could work on in the next 3 to 4 weeks.
Well, let me ask Pedro what you think of that. I mean, was there a failure on Lula's campaign in that sense?
No, I think this is a very tough task to stop the advance of the far right in Brazil, and I could say the fascism in Brazil. And I don't use this word, this concept in vain. I'm talking about a leader that uses violence as a method, that has a mass movement behind, that treats his opponents as enemies that should be eliminated. So I think this second round must show that in one side we have a predictable leader, that is Lula, which is very pragmatic, which can dialogue with all the society, and the other side, an unprepared, an unpredictable leader that is always threatening the institutions. And so I think this is important to show to everyone, to the Brazilian people, that we have to stop the advance of the far right and these fascist futures that we have in the Brazilian society.
We've heard that said in various parts of the world, yet the far right seems to continue gaining momentum. Chayenne, so tell me what you think the next weeks will look like leading up to this final vote. I mean, how ugly could this get?
I think it could get very, very ugly. We saw the last debate that took place, if I'm not mistaken, last Friday, where you had a series of other candidates debating each other. And what the debate ultimately became were either attacks on Bolsonaro's ability and fitness to be reelected as president, or Lula's reputation for being corrupt, for his time in jail and whatnot. And I think what we're going to see over the next few weeks is really a laser focus of both campaigns on both from Lula's side on Bolsonaro's handling of the campaign, the situation of the economy and health and high levels of unemployment in Brazil, and Bolsonaro, on the other hand, really focusing on Lula's past, his stint in jail, and again, as some of the other panelists here have mentioned, this fear of fascism, of the rise of the far right. So it's going to get very vicious, and I think we're going to see that play out in the debate, but most importantly in social media. I was speaking with some of my contacts in Brazil. There are messages going around on WhatsApp and on Facebook of, for example, Bolsonaro supporters saying that if Lula wins, we're going to have to start eating dog meat, and that is the future of Brazil under PT's rule. So it's going to get pretty ugly.
Right. Mark, are you on the same page there, especially in tracking social media and its behavior in this election?
Well, I think it'll be two levels. On the social media front, it's gonna be ugly, but I think Bolsonaro has an interest in appearing moderate and moving to the center. So he'll try to be on his best behavior in kind of high-profile events, big media interviews, and if there is a presidential debate. On the other hand, I think Lula has to switch tracks and begin to talk about education, health, workforce development, and job creation. He's got to unroll some detailed plans that sharply contrast with Bolsonaro's lack of vision and lack of concrete policy proposals to move Brazil forward. I think Lula needs to show more about what he plans to do in the first 100 days and in the first year of a prospective government.
Yeah, because getting into, what really matters to Brazilian voters at this point. When we look abroad, we hear so much about what Bolsonaro has done or not done for the environment. But, where does that rank among Brazilian voters themselves? Do they care more about the wider, bigger, existential kind of issues, or are they just looking at the economy and even, factoring in things like religion?
Well, if I could just touch on that real quick, Minas Gerais is going to play a pivotal role. It's very representative of Brazil. That's the place where Bolsonaro has to increase his popularity in 4 weeks. And I think Mineiros, the people of Minas Gerais, are going to be listening to Lula and say, what have you got for us in terms of formal job creation and improving the public health care delivery system that's been so undermined by Bolsonaro's, just inability to administer that public health system during the pandemic. So I think that's critical for him to get back to those bread and butter issues, especially in Minas Gerais, where this decision about the next president of Brazil is likely to take place.
Pedro, how much does Minas Gerais actually, center in on where you're focused now in this campaign for the next weeks?
Yes, I think Minas Gerais is a great state that is very important for the election. Lula won there, and São Paulo, I think, would be the biggest battle in the campaign, because there was an unpredictable result of Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro won in São Paulo, and his candidate to the state of São Paulo also went to the second round at the first place. So I think the Lula will remain in São Paulo for a long time in this campaign, because I think this is a strategic place to be. So, but I do think that we have in this election a very, very difficult task for Bolsonaro, because more than a half of the population wouldn't vote for him in any circumstances. So I think this is the way to deal with this election, and I think the Worker Party will explore this, and will also explore a victory of Lula, because there is this expectancy of the first round, but the Lula's party made grew in terms of deputies, in terms of Senate. In the Senate, they went from 7 to 9. The Chamber of Deputies from 56 to 68. So it's not a defeat. We didn't got the election the first round, but we still have the second round to go, and we will win this election.
That's one way to look at it. But I mean, Cheyenne, let me come back to you, because from the other candidates then who, got only marginal support in the first round, is there, any strong indication of where their votes will go? Because they will ultimately be the kingmakers, as will those 37 million invalidated votes in the first round.
Absolutely, yes. So what we know so far is that one of the first things that Lula's campaign did was reach out to the campaigns of those two candidates to figure it out. How do we work together? How can I adjust my messaging to, be appealing to those millions of votes that I very much need going into the runoff? Bolsonaro was a little bit more cautious. If I'm not mistaken, his words were something along the lines of, I am open to connecting with those candidates to see if there's an opportunity to partner. My guess is that both of those two candidates will be very involved in this in the next few weeks, feeling the weight of responsibility of, really shifting the future and shaping what might happen at the end of the month. So a lot of power in their hands, and likely that, they will try to shift some of those votes to Lula, but still undetermined. And in terms of the people that didn't show up, that didn't vote, usually those numbers tend to go up in runoff elections. So usually you see more people showing up in the first round. So still undetermined what will happen. If maybe because this is a historical election, so many things are different already, right? In the numbers between the first and the second place, and some other factors, it is possible that maybe we won't see an increase in abstention, but historically that tends to be the case.
Mark, when we look at the voters themselves and how they're canvassed when it comes to voter polling, Cheyenne had brought up before that some voters were actually just reluctant to say that they supported the far right, but they did come out to the polling stations and vote for Bolsonaro. You've also got evangelical Christians and Catholics, of course, and the question about how influential they are, because some argue it is quite disproportionate. But when you have, by some estimates, I think 80% of the population identifying with one of those religions, catering to the church could be a deciding factor. I mean, I've read some tweets that actually say Lula will persecute Christians. Again, here we go on social media, which you brought up as one of the most influential factors potentially in this election. So what do you make of the religion factor now in Brazil?
Well, I think I wouldn't say it's religion. It's more church-based, meaning that evangelical churches are well organized. They have social media communication mechanisms, also law enforcement and the military. So now Bolsonaro's core constituencies are very well organized through social media and can mobilize without kind of being detected in the streets, so to speak. And I think we see that in the polling. In particular, in 2018, Bolsonaro had a bandwagon effect in September of 2018 that was largely undetected, and I think we're seeing the same thing now. Whereas Lula's base of support is more traditional. It's linked to leaders of organized social movements, labor unions, and so forth. And we can detect those segments of the population and so forth with polling. So the polling is uneven, no question about it. But the best poll of all is the balloting. And now we know that they're 5% apart. And for Bolsonaro to win, he's going to have to flip somewhere between 5 million votes, and that's going to be very, very difficult because I think, as Cheyenne said, the abstention rate will continue to be high in the second round, and Bolsonaro is going to have to flip Lula voters. I think at this point, I wouldn't be surprised if a few Bolsonaro voters actually flipped to Lula because they wanted a second round, they wanted to send a message, but now they're ready to move on to a new chapter. So we could see that as well. That happened in 2006 when Geraldo Alckmin, who's now the running mate for Lula, ran against Lula and actually lost some votes in the second round. So I think things could be wild,
Yeah.
but Lula is in the driver's seat.
Sounds like it. You know, Pedro, when we look at kind of the other side of the spectrum, so to speak, I'd actually like to look at what some from Brazil's minority religions have been saying. And this is a tweet from Jews for Democracy. They said the candidates, especially those from the far right, talk all the time about the Christian population and governing for them. Christians are the majority, but the Brazilian people are diverse. The state is secular, and the president elected shall govern for all. Do you think somehow secularism has become less attractive in Brazil, hence the rise of the far right and the power of the Christian majority in the country?
Yes, I think the far right expansion has everything to do with this evangelical movement and this network that they gave. And I think this electoral wave between, the last 2 days that just make the results different has to do with this network of evangelical churches and also with this media, the social media that Bolsonaro uses a lot better than Lula. So I think this religious questions in Brazil is very important. And the Lula's campaign has been looking at this very closely. But it's very difficult to get inside this very solid networks that has been made. And with Bolsonaro in the government, he has the instruments, the power, and the money to make them to be very reliable in his campaign. So this is a very difficult task that we have to deal in Brazil, not only for this election, but to the following years, and to see if we can depoliticize the religion in Brazil.
Depoliticize the religion. I mean, Cheyenne, it almost seems at this point like sometimes secularism is a liability for a candidate.
Yeah, so I think, just to follow on the thread here, this demographic growth of evangelicalism combined with, theological legislative initiatives is very appealing. And I think that while we've seen some polls in Brazil that show Brazilians are more favorable to some other social policies, such as abortion rights for women, Brazilian society is generally somewhat conservative, and a politics of morality tends to be very appealing. So when you think about what evangelicals do, they take a lot of the anxieties concerning, life in general, but family, sexuality, gender roles, and what they do is they articulate those into politics and leverage them into policy. So being secular sort of strips you from the ability to speak to those issues in ways that evangelicals have been able to and will continue to do, which is what's really important here that we don't miss is regardless of what happens at the end of October, this movement is here to stay, right? Very much like what we've seen in the United States with Donald Trump and the far right movement. Once Trump was no longer in office, that sentiment, that movement, that base didn't go away. And that will also be the case in Brazil. So we will see that base live in Congress with that strong force backed by Bolsonaro, but you will also see that with the people long after Bolsonaro is gone, if that ends up being the case.
Right. I mean, Mark, it's kind of impossible to ignore the parallels between these politicians in Brazil and what happened with Trump in 2016, not least because Bolsonaro is still saying if he loses this election at the end of the month, he will call fraud. His conspiracy theories are still out there. He doesn't have a lot of complaints, obviously, just like Trump. When he wins the elections, then everything is fine. But if he does lose, as polls are predicting, what's going to happen?
Andrea, that's the big ticket question. I think Brazil did such a good job administering their elections yesterday and have such a strong record of high competency in administrating these elections. It's going to be very difficult for Bolsonaro to pull off, something because, it's just got much more higher credibility than we have here in the United States.
Okay. Pedro, just quickly, what are you expecting and what are you prepared for as far as what a Lula victory that you're anticipating, obviously, might bring as far as backlash from the Bolsonaro camp?
Yes, I think this is very unpredictable what Bolsonaro will do. I think the first round he was worried also about the representatives and his allies, so he did moderate his discourse. But in the second round, I think he knows he will lose, and we can expect some new things because he needs a new fact to win the election.
Yeah. Pedro Rossi, Chayenne Polimedio, and Mark Langevin, thank you all so much for being with us on this edition of the Newsmakers. Unfortunately, we're completely out of time. But really, thanks for all your insight, and of course to our viewers as well for tuning in. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.